You can see that the screen is populated with a lot of information from the previous lesson. So please make sure to review that lesson before continuing with this one. But basically, what we're going to be doing here is getting more precise about notating the vocal as well as the instrumental registers using one more tool that we're going to add to our arsenal, which is the tool that indicates the specific register and applies it to the staff. I don't know why I'm speaking so slowly. That seems a little bit, I don't know, unusual. But anyway, what is this idea of having some sort of symbol that indicates register? Well, that is called, let me zoom in on this so you're not confused with all the other information, that is called a clef. So a clef, by definition, it's really very simple. It is some sort of symbol designating register. Now, there's a little bit more to it, just a little bit more, but where I'm going to save that, sort of a second part to this definition, until a little bit later. But for now, let's start with this. What is a clef? A symbol indicating or designating register. Well, we have two broad categories of registers in front of us, right? On the one hand, we've got those gross instrumental registers of bass and of treble. Then we have the vocal registers, right? These guys of soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and of course the sort of in-between registers of mezzo, soprano, and the baritone. Okay. In fact, any baritones listening to this or mezzos, don't be offended. Hey, if I were a singer, I'd be a baritone. So I wear that range with pride, that register with pride. Anyway, so the clef is a symbol that is applied to the staff, and it tells us where to look on the keyboard, or even more broadly, where to look in the registral space. Because remember, we have a huge amount of space, at least on the Western keyboard, from A0 all the way at the bottom to C8 at the top, right? That is a interval size, as you remember, of 52 letters from A0 to C8, right? The bass plus the treble. 24 plus 29 is 53 minus the overlap at C4. Please review this in another video. That equals 52. There is no single voice that can sing all 52 of those letters. And if there is, and I believe I remember someone in the world record books who actually was able to do that. But remember, these are outliers. These are exceptions. Most singers, right, the average that we're using, cover about an octave and a half, right, about a range of 11 letters. So there's no one singer that can cover the entire instrumental range of the keyboard. Why am I harping on this? Because the staff only covers 11 letters, right, from the bottom here to the top. So if this is an 11th and yet the keyboard covers 52, then obviously we need to be able to know where we are on the keyboard to indicate that we're singing a soprano range or playing a treble range, right? So for that, we need a clef. So what do these clefs look like? Some of them are very familiar to you because a lot of people actually get tattoos of these things. No, that's not entirely serious. But I had students who asked me, should I get a tattoo of a treble clef and put it on my neck? And so I always say, well, it's kind of cliche to do that, but you know what? You do you. So let's see. This is what a treble clef looks like. And what is the treble clef? Well, that's easy. It's a symbol designating the treble register, right? And that's the symbol. It looks like this. What about the clef that indicates the bass register? What does that look like? Well, that looks like this. Okay, So far, so good. You've probably seen these because these are pretty ubiquitous in pop culture, like any movie, for example, that shows someone furiously scribbling on manuscript paper, where the staff lines are, like what we have here in front of us. You've probably seen these two symbols. Uh, Go, for example, and look at the movie Amadeus from the 1980s, right? Mozart, or as represented, is constantly using these symbols, right? These clefs. But there's also one additional clef that stands for or indicates the soprano, the alto, and the tenor registers. And that looks like this. Now, if you use software notation, of course, the symbols, the clefs, are going to look a bit more, in terms of calligraphy, they're going to look much better than what I'm doing here. But this gives you an approximation of what they look like. So remember, this is the treble clef, this is the bass clef, and this one we'll have to get to in a second. But this one is called more generically the C clef. And if it's not called the C clef, it will be called either the soprano clef, or the alto clef, or the tenor clef, or in some cases, and this is a very, very rare case scenario, the mezzo soprano clef or the baritone clef. I'm going to put these in parentheses because these are exceedingly rare, and most likely you will never or almost never see these applied, but you will certainly see them applied for soprano, alto, and tenor. But this brings me back to my definition of clef. Remember that I started saying that it's a symbol designating register and I trailed off because I told you that the second part of the definition was coming up. Here's the second part of the definition because I ended up saying C clef. C clef refers to a reference pitch. In this case, C4 specifically, right? We're no longer worrying about octave equivalence, right? Where all the letters are used abstractly and it doesn't matter which octave they're in. Right now, because we're using clefs, octave designations really do matter. So C clef really means C4 clef, and C4 is a reference pitch. So this tells us that a clef indicates two things. For one thing, it designates register. That's number one. And number two, do I have room? All right, I'm going to put it down here and you'll just remember what I'm talking about. And number two, here I'll draw an arrow, that may help, right? And number two, it indicates a reference pitch. So this interesting clef, the C clef, the reference pitch is C4, and the register is soprano, alto, tenor, rarely mezzo soprano and baritone, depending on how it's positioned on the staff, because it's a movable clef. I'll show that to you in a second. And then these two, the treble and the bass, first of all, not movable or no longer movable in modern music, in the modern practice of Western music notation. And these have two other reference pitches. The treble is also called the G clef because G4 is the reference pitch. And the bass clef, yeah, wow, I've really run out of space here. The bass clef is called the F clef, and the specific octave designation for that F in the bass is F3. Okay, so now that we know that every clef designates both a register as well as a reference pitch, let's focus on that movable clef that I was talking about earlier, specifically that C clef. And let's see how it looks when it's applied to the staff. So we're going to use this staff right there, and I'm going to place the C clef right there so that its arches overlap or meet at the first line. This first line is called C4, right? That's the reference pitch. So the property of the C clef is wherever its arches meet is always called C4. Now, what we can do here is we can figure out the range of the soprano because this, after all, is the soprano register. Well, why did I jump to that conclusion so quickly? Remember that I had worked this out earlier when I was using the soprano over here on my diagram, and then to practice, I indicated that C4 was all the way at the bottom of the staff on the first line. Now, at the time, that was an arbitrary decision, but now you can see that there was some purpose behind it, which is to say that if we're actually going to apply a clef to this staff that indicates the range of the soprano, it turns out that C4 is indicated on the first line. So how do I know that this is the soprano and not any of the other vocal registers like the alto or the tenor, right? And of course, the mezzo-soprano and the baritone. Well, I know that because the soprano has C4 toward the bottom of this person's range. So one thing that we know about the staff is that without using ledger lines, right, those extra lines above or beyond the staff, what we can do is we can indicate the range of one individual staff as the note head on the space below the staff all the way up to the note head on top of the staff, right? And we know that this is a range of 11 notes or a size of 11. So we've already figured out what an 11th above C4 is. If you recall, in the previous lesson, here was our range of 11 notes. And we figured it out right there with this exercise, which I hope that you'll review. But let's do it a little bit differently over here on the bottom. So if C4 is the first line on the staff, then the space directly below it will be, as we know, a size 2 in reverse alphabetical order, because as we move down the staff, we're going down the alphabet and we're going to the left on the keyboard. So what key is a step below C4? Well, what alphabetically is below C? The answer is B. And remember that the octave designations change at every C. So if we go below C and we're in the fourth octave, the letter below C4 will have to be B in the third octave. So this is B3. And so the next question is, what is an 11th above B3? And remember that the way that we can figure this out is certainly the long way, where we simply count 11 letters starting with B. So we go B3, C4, D4, E4, F4, etc., etc., etc. It just seems so long-winded, and we don't need to do it that way, right? So instead, let's do it using the concept of reduced or simplified intervals and compound equivalents. So what we're going to do is we're going to remember that an 11th can be split into an octave plus a fourth. Review the previous lessons. But very quickly, why does that work? Well, because an octave plus a fourth is 12 minus 1 overlap, which is 11. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go up a fourth from B3 and then up an octave, and that's going to give us an 11th above B3. Up a fourth from B3 is pretty simple, right? We can simply go B3, C4, D4, E4. Recognize that I just counted 4 letters, right? So again, I can do this on the staff. So B3, and then C4, up a step, D4, up a step, E4, right? So this is E4, and hopefully you all recognize by this point, because we've had a lot of practice, that this is an octave. How do I know? Because every octave is 3 skips, 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus a step, obviously subtracting out the overlaps. Remember, this is musical math, because if you saw this problem out of context, 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 2, well, that does not equal 8. Obviously, it equals 11. But remember, we have several overlaps here, right? And we have to subtract out those overlaps. There are 3 of them to get our octave, okay? So we have here a fourth, here an octave, And again, as we've already done, an octave plus a fourth is a 12th minus 1, which yields 11. So if E4 is on the second line, what is the label? Again, let's clear some space. There's a lot going on here. What is the label of the topmost note head above the staff? Well, it's an octave above E4, which is E5. So that tells us that the approximate range, at least as it exists, so the exact range as it exists on the staff, but approximate because sopranos come in all varieties, right, of range types, but roughly B3 up to E5. That's the soprano register. Let's move on to the next one. Now, the next positioning of the C clef is where its arches meet at the third line, which is right there. Now this is C4 again, because remember, that's the rule for this C clef. Wherever the arches meet is going to be middle C, or C4. And knowing this information, we can easily figure out the range of this voice type. Now remember that C4 meets in the middle, or not meets in the middle, I'm sorry, but C4 is in the middle of the alto, right? Remember that here's the alto's range right there, and C4 is right there approximately in the middle. So knowing that C4 is on the middle line, it's pretty easy to figure out what this note head is and what this note head indicates, including both the letter name and the octave designation. So let's do it. It's going to be pretty simple. In fact, you know what? How about we start with the bottom, right? It really doesn't matter. But here's what I'm seeing. C4 is on a line. This is on a space. The interval size must be even or odd, right? I'm asking you, what does it have to be? It has to be even because these are not the same position on, or the same type of position on the staff. A line to a space is always an even-sized interval. So this tells me that what I can do is maybe find some sort of compounded skip, like maybe I'll skip down and then skip down again, and then from here, from the first line to the space below is a step. So in other words, 3, 3, and 2. Well, let's see. That's pretty simple. 3 plus 3 plus 2 is, after all, 8. But I have to subtract out how many overlaps, right? That's the interesting question. I think about this. And I'm going to subtract out one overlap here, another overlap here. Remember, we're adding 3 elements, 1, 2, 3, and I have to subtract out 2 overlaps. So the interval here is a 1/6 below C4. What's a 1/6 below C4? Well, again, it's pretty easy because we can count letter by letter alphabetically, C down to B, down to A, etc. In fact, let's do that. C, B, A, 1, 2, 3, and then G, F, E, another 3. So C down to E is a 1/6 below, and it's in the third octave. So this is E3. If you want a somewhat faster way of doing it, here's what we can do. What is a 5th below C4? A 5th below C4, which will land us right there on the first line, is F3. And what's a step below F3? Well, it's E3. Okay, you get it. So we know that using in the alto clef, because that's what this is, in the alto clef, the lowest part of its range is E3. What is an 11th above? Well, remember the shortcut? We go up a 4th, and then we go up an 11th, just like we did for the soprano, correct? So let's do that really quickly. A 4th above E3 is going to be, we just go 1, 2, 3, 4, E, F, G, A. That's going to be A3, plus an octave is A4. If you want to see this spelled out, then let's just do it right there on the staff. So E3, we go up a step. This is going to be a step above E, which is F3. The next space is G3, and then the next line is A3. To go up an octave means that we go up 3 skips. So 1, 2, 3, and a step. And this is an octave. And so an octave above A3 is A4. And that is the range, at least as indicated on the staff using the Alto Clef. That's the range of the alto register, right? That's the exact range on the staff and the approximate range of an alto singer. Because just like with sopranos, altos come in all sorts of varieties, and some can sing a bit lower, some can sing a bit higher, but that's roughly correct, all right? All the way from E3 up to A4. So let's do this with one more voice type for this lesson, and then we'll move to our next unit of study with this. So we have one more to look at, so let me erase some stuff. Or actually, no, I don't have to erase anything because I have a virtual palette here. One more. I'm going to position the C clef so that it overlaps at line number 4. And that, of course, is C4. Now, if you've been wondering, well, which voice is this? Well, for this person, C4 is toward the top of the range. So as you look at this chart above, you notice that we've been moving from soprano down to the contralto or the alto. And so the next logical step is to tackle the tenor, because these are the 3 voice types, soprano, alto, and tenor, that use that movable C clef. Movable because we can position it at different points along the staff. And so our last one to examine for this particular lesson is the tenor. So the tenor has C4 on line number 4. And so the question again is figuring out, in terms of the tenor's range of course, an 11th, what's the bottom and what's the top? What letters do we use and octave designations? So this is actually fairly simple to do because it's precisely what we did with the alto. But how about this time? Instead of figuring out the bottom of the range, let's start with the top. So I'd like to figure out this position, which is again the space above the staff. So knowing what I know, that the middle line as my reference pitch is C4, what's the interval from this 4th line up to that space above the staff? Again, I'm really hoping that you're seeing this as what we had talked about earlier, what I had talked about earlier, which is a skip plus a step. Do you remember that that is automatically a 4th, right? 3 plus 2, 5, minus the overlap right there, that's minus 1, so it's a 4th. Well, what's a 4th above C4? Well, that shouldn't be too hard because a 4th above C4 is F4, right? How do I know that so quickly? I just count C, D, E, F, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. It's within the same octave, so this is F4. And knowing this, could I figure out what this letter is an 11th down from F4? Well, there are a couple of ways of doing this. Let's start with the easy way. By this point, you should be looking at these 3 ranges, the soprano, the alto, and the tenor, and you should be thinking, well, I remember something about an 11th above C4. What was that? What was that? From a different lesson? Oh yeah, right here, when we were dealing with these ranges, an 11th above C4 is F5. So wouldn't it stand to reason that if I'm now ending with F4 instead of F5, an 11th below that would actually be some sort of C, because a 4th below F is C, and an 11th is a compound equivalent of that reduced 4th. So wouldn't the bottom here be C3. Okay, now if that was a little bit too quick, let's work this out more methodically, more slowly. Here is F4 as we've already figured out. What's an octave below F4? An octave below F4 is obviously F3. But how do I indicate this on the staff? Well, once again, 3 skips and a step. 1, 2, 3, and a step right there. That is F3. What is a fourth below F3? Again, using the staff. Well, I just go from this second line, I'm going to count that as 1, down to the space below it, 2, down to the line below that, 3, and finally the space below that, 4. There it is. And so F, E, D, C, 1, 2, 3, 4. The bottom is C3. And so C3 up to F4 is a range of 11. And that is the precise range of the tenor using the tenor clef, right, or the movable C clef, and the approximate range of every tenor, roughly C3 up to F4. So if you look at this section of the page, you can see that our 3 standard, right, soprano, alto, and tenor clefs indicate very specific ranges of 11ths, right? For the soprano, it's going to be B3 up to E5. For the alto, right, I know there's a lot of information here, it's going to be E3 up to A4. And for the tenor, it's going to be C3 up to F4. Those are the ranges. Now, do I care as a teacher, do I care that you memorize those? No, not at all. What I care about is that you understand before we leave this lesson a couple of really fundamental things. That the C clef is a movable clef. It uses C4 as a reference wherever the arches of the actual clef shape meet. And from there, using what we've already talked about when it comes to the intervals always present on every single staff, how to figure out unison, steps, skips, and any kind of leap, from there you can always figure out how the other letters and octave designations are notated according to that particular clef. In the next lesson, we're going to apply all of this to the treble and the bass clefs, and that's the most relevant when it comes to playing the piano.